Welcome to Regulate Tech. This is our 42nd and year-end closing session for 2021. We thought we would do a little bit of reflection, think about the year that was, talk a little bit about the podcast, and perhaps also speculate a little bit about the year that's yet to come, 2022. What will happen? What will the big things be? The themes, the trends. So stay tuned. We'll get back to those. But let's start about this podcast, which is new for this year. So tell me, Richard, how do you feel about the podcast?
So it's been fun. And here we are in episode 42 discussing the meaning of the podcast, because that's the magic number 42, isn't it? For all us Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fans. So it's been fun. I've really enjoyed it. And I think listeners can tell that we enjoy ourselves. It's great to get together once a week and have some time talking through the hot issues. In a way, I think what we're doing is sort of exposing to the world the kind of conversations we might have had in our previous roles with these tech companies when we would meet up and talk about the issues of the day. But I feel we've been able to do that and then go further. And I hope people have found useful the fact that we've, I think, been able to share some of our experience of building policy teams and working with policy teams, which I hope goes some way to kind of demystifying this thing. If there's anything we want to do, it's sort of take this thing that can appear sort of to some people, mysterious, somehow socially harmful, and try and explain how it actually works and see that there is some social value in the kind of work that you and I have spent, each of us are sort of more than a decade doing. So I hope that sort of come through, and I've certainly enjoyed it and enjoyed working through all these issues. And I feel in the 41 previous episodes, if people have the time to listen to them, they'll be able to find out, I hope, something interesting about pretty much any of the hot topical tech issues of the day. And that in itself may, even if they disagree with us, it may prove useful as a kind of stimulation for thought.
Especially if they disagree with us, right? Because that's the point. Because that's what we want. We want people to disagree with us, because when they do, I think that we move this debate forward. And for me, one of the things that really has been sort of one of the big takeaways is that I think many of the subjects that we have discussed, the ideas that you have put on the table, that we have sort of bandied about, are open questions.
Yes,
they're ongoing processes, and being able to feed into them from sort of an outsider perspective, I think has been really, really nice. Even if we're probably going to be discredited as outsiders, we're going to be like, people are going to think that we're not really outsiders. We are actually one step removed from what we did before, which I think is helpful. So do you have a favorite episode?
I really enjoyed the one where we talked about committee hearings. I think episode 30, when we talked about committee hearings, because those like play quite a large part in the life of a public policy team. They become quite dominant. And I enjoyed just being able to talk about that, frankly, and openly about how it feels from our side of the table to go into those committee hearings. They're typically televised, and it's the old iceberg thing, isn't it? You're seeing the tip of the iceberg. You're not seeing the 9/10 of it that's underwater, where the interesting stuff is happening. And so, I say, for me, that was kind of cathartic to be able to talk through that, and I hope sort of useful for other people to hear how it feels from the side of those people who are going in front of a committee. What about you? Where were you on your favourites?
Well, I think just to comment on that, I think you're right. I mean, we've tried to have this mix of craft episodes where we talked about what does policy look like and what is the craft. And I hope that those have been helpful. And I really like the feedback that we've gotten, where people have both let us know when we got it wrong and said this was really helpful because I was thinking through something. So I'd like to encourage people to keep that feedback coming, because that helps us to make the episodes more interesting. The others are more subject oriented,
right,
sort of looking into the issues, etc. And I think those are it's sort of another hopefully interesting format. My favorite, I think, I really liked it when we read Barlow.
Oh yes, yeah.
because we read an entire text, and it was so seminar like, and we were looking into the sort of the choice of words, the text, the context of and that entire chapter also feels concluded. The cyber libertarian chapter feels concluded. It was nice to have a chance to reflect on an ideological arc that has closed, if that makes sense.
So that was episode 24, I think it was, the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. Yes,
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, really enjoyed that one as well. And as you say, we've got, as I'm sort of looking through the episodes, there are these sort of four buckets I think you can put the episodes into. There are the ones that are about the business of doing policy work, and we talk about working with legal teams and comms teams and how to structure policy teams. There are the ones that are looking at classic texts, which the John Perry Barlow one is a great example. And there are 3 or 4 others where we look at classic texts over the years that have influenced the debate. And I agree the John Perry Barlow one is kind of special within that. There are some where we look at topical policy issues, so things that are hot today, responding to what's in the news environment. And then there's a perhaps the largest number of ones where we're looking at perennial policy issues, the policy issues that have been around for a long time. So things like net neutrality, which is, been there forever, copyright, which have been there forever. But I certainly, yes, the John Perry Barlow one also stood out for me as kind of a lot of fun to talk about that text. I think we've also at times talked about Larry Lessig's text, which has also been interesting. Yeah. And then most recently, Eric S. Raymond's The Cathedral and the Bazaar, I think in episode 40. So all of those have been great for me. And I think you to go back and revisit something in many cases that we hadn't read for a number of years and see how relevant it is today in 2021.
Yeah, and also it's an attempt to sort of find or articulate the kind of canon for tech policy, where there are a couple of texts that have been really influential. I mean, you mentioned the Cathedral and Bazaar. It had an enormous influence on tech policy because it had an enormous influence on developers. It's not just inside baseball, but it's all of the different stakeholders that shape tech policy have a couple of texts that they relate to, and I think. Lessig is another one, Code, the 4 regulators, right? And yes. I think that those, having those mental models, examining them and thinking through them, I think that's really, to me, it's helpful to just reflect on them with a little bit of distance as well. So, so as you say, it's been maybe it's equal parts therapy and podcast.
Between the two. And so Lessig was episode 14, and then the other 2 classic texts I think we looked at were the OECD privacy principles in episode 17, which are still very, very current. The OECD privacy principles help frame legislation like the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation today, so that's super present. And then episode 31, the Budapest Convention. So we've looked at some government texts as well, the Budapest Convention on cybersecurity and cybercrime. So we've looked at a range of them, both sort of arguably sort of text from the outsiders in the tech world, but also text from insiders in the governmental world responding to the advent of the internet and the way the internet is shaping our world.
What is an episode that you would still like to do, but we haven't gotten to yet?
Ooh, so I think we've only just scratched the surface of competition law. So we did have an episode, I think we talked about big organizations.
From farmers market to pharma markets.
Yep, that's right. 23 was a big one. And then we've touched on competition in a number of other issues. So for example, I know as we've talked about things like online safety, I've expressed my view that breaking up companies is not necessarily automatically going to lead to good outcomes from online safety point of view. It doesn't, it's a trade-off, and actually safety might suffer with smaller entities. That's just one example of where we've sort of bumped into some of these competition issues. But it is very current in the debate, and I think it's certainly one we'll come back to in 2022. It's difficult, it's complex, there's quite different schools of thought in different parts of the world and in different ends of the political spectrum, but I think it's certainly one that we'd need to come back to again and deserves more time. And yourself, what are you missing?
I think one that would perhaps be controversial but really interesting to go through in more depth than we've done so far, at least, is one on trade associations.
Oh, yes.
And think about trade associations, how to work with them, when to start them, when to leave them, what their fortes are, their strengths, and where they have some peculiar weaknesses, how to engage. Is it important to be on the board? I think there's tons of stuff around those third parties, and it's not just trade associations. I think it can be expert groups, working groups, it can be panels, it can be even things like how do you work with academics and how do you absolutely not work with academics. And I think that whole field or third parties that's so, because it's so, in a sense, when people talk about it, it's always as if there was this nefarious intent in collaborating, this trade association. You're funding third parties, and people make it sound as if you're killing kittens.
Yes.
I mean, it's like it's and I think that to understand the ecosystem of policy, I think is an episode that would be nice to dig into.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And plus, I mean, at the same time, you can both be criticized for funding third parties. That's offensive. And at the same time, be approached by a steady stream of people with begging bowls saying, you really, really need to fund us because, you're evil. And by funding us, you'll somehow mitigate the evilness. And so you do end up with this sort of weird dichotomy of both demands for funding and then criticism of the fact you funded, and trying to create some kind of ethical, principled framework around that. And one, ideally, you can be very transparent about and explain to the world exactly what your rationale is, I think is difficult. And yes, I agree. It'd be great to come back to an episode on that. And I think we've both had good and bad experiences, including making mistakes in this area where you funded something you thought in good faith and it's come back and caused you more harm than good.
I think yeah, I think so. And the closest we got, and I thought that was a really nice episode, and on reflection, I think a really important one, was when we talked about whether to collaborate with or oppose other tech companies, how tech companies work together. I don't remember the number of that episode, but I think that was reflecting also on the fact that we were in our previous lives in these two very different positions, where sometimes you had to ask yourself, is this an industry issue or can I get out from under it and sort of escape and let it be a sort of company issue for someone else. Yeah. And I think, and that's of course something that also then happens in trade associations, where you block others' proposals, or you get together and you will find a unified interest. So I think that's one that I'd like to do. Are there any others on your side?
I was the collaboration one was episode 25, and I certainly had some feedback from people who work in tech companies going that was actually helpful to them as they think this thing through. So yes, so that was that. And then I guess one that I can see one of the themes we've come back to a number of times as splinter nets, jurisdiction, all of these questions. And I guess that is the uber question for tech policy, because, we're talking a lot about specifics of regulation. Regulation typically happens at the national level, exception in the case of EU, it's the kind of supranational collective level, but basically it's still a national or in some cases, say, the regional game that people are playing. And the internet is this global technology, so we keep coming back to. And so, all of the questions about regulation have to be set against these questions of splinter nets, jurisdiction, geographical questions. As people like the UK are kind of racing ahead with their UK online safety bill, they're doing that purely from a sort of national perspective. And yet it creates structures which, if they were copied by another 140 countries, would be, create a dramatically different landscape for the businesses. One country doing something may be workable, 3 or 4 countries doing it may still be workable, 140 countries doing it may be orders of magnitude more onerous for tech companies. And people may argue that's fine, that's okay. But in the real world, it may be that they become so onerous that, and we talked a lot about this, that the choice of tech companies is then to opt out of the less valuable markets. So in other words, the trade-off becomes, I'll accept the regulation in my home market because I have to. And then beyond that, I'm going to be doing a calculation as to whether the cost of the regulation outweighs the benefit of being in that market. And it's still something we've not, not really settled as a business. And I think as Europe runs ahead with its Digital Services Act, and the UK runs ahead with its online safety bill, and a few other pieces of legislation sort of come through, if India regulates and a few other large markets regulate, we may hit these splinter net questions actually much sooner than we think. We've kind of been postponing them for years, and they may arrive. So that's one thing that I think, we've touched on a number of times in the last year, and it doesn't surprise me we did, but maybe one that comes to the fore in 2022.
That's a good point. I like that, and I think that one of the things that when I hear you talking about this, one of the things that we could do that I think would be interesting is to perhaps talk about the longer term internet evolution question. We talk about splinternets, but what does that really mean? What are the different forms, and how do we think this plays out? Because to take it one step further, if a company decides to opt out of certain markets, then what you get is not just splinter nets. You actually also get tiers of quality. So some countries will have access to really good services, some countries will not, and suddenly you cement a certain amount of inequality in the world by limiting or tiering access to services in a way that's really quite interesting. Plus, of course, at some point you have to talk about the geopolitical nature of the internet long term. Like, what's the 50-year vision here? I think it's a speculative session, but a really interesting one, especially if we could sort of nudge a few experts to perhaps join us and discuss. That would be really interesting.
It would, and because it works on the two levels. There's the internet as a set of protocols and the technology, and then there's the internet as the collection of services that most ordinary people use on a daily basis. And so you've got to look at each of those. Are the protocols likely to change in any sense? And there was some discussion sometimes around technical breakaways using particular protocols and standards that are different from the mainstream. But even more immediately, I think, is this variation in the services that are on offer. And whether for each country, when I go from country to country, the package of services that I'm offered could change quite dramatically, when that's not the case today. In most cases, apart from, obvious exceptions like China, but in most of the rest of the world, you go to any country in the world and you can access the same bucket of services. If that changes, that's going to be really quite different.
What do you think about sessions that are more inside baseball? I had one idea of a session that I never raised because I thought it was too narrow, but it strikes me that it might actually be a really interesting one, and that's one that would essentially be entitled "Being a European in a US Tech Company."
Oh yes,
I think that would be an interesting session, but I'm also aware that I might be sort of just begging for my own sick aunt here. What do you think? Would that be interesting?
We I think, again, it's come up a couple of times. I can remember we've made some observations about trying to influence policy in that way. I think that could be interesting, but maybe be an interesting chance to sort of broaden that out. We have a lot of former colleagues now who are working for Chinese companies.
Such a good point.
So what's it like to be a European Chinese company? What's it like to be Chinese in a European or an American company? I actually think there's a sort of multi-dimensional aspect to it here that starts to get really interesting. So there is that dimension that we're familiar with, but I'm just thinking, there may be a much broader dimension. And people who've moved, actually, what would be really interesting is somebody who has moved from a European who's working for a European company who's moved to an American company and moved to a Chinese company and can compare all of those different experiences. So should we try and find those people and see if they're willing? Well, they might need to be working for nobody to be willing to come on and have a candid thing. Or we could use one of those vocoder things where we distort their voice. And
I like that. We should have like an anonymous guest.
Anonymous guest who will tell us how it was to work for different companies. Yeah.
I think that, and it's such a good point. I think what we should do, instead of sort of focusing on the European-US axis, is the way that you describe, is actually about making the point that there's no such thing as a multinational company. All companies have, in a sense, a nationality, and how does the nationality of the company affect the people who work there, the policies they choose, the way they make decisions. This is another one that I've been thinking a lot about. Like, how are companies making decisions, and what kinds of decisions are not being made? Because we had this experience, and we've discussed it in a couple of episodes, where you, at the edges of the network in country, what needs to be done, that needs to be done now, but then you have to work your way down into the core of the company, and by the time you reach the right decision makers, you're like, we already suffered all the reputational damage.
Yes.
If we're now backtracking, we're just reawakening this same issue, and we're going to suffer that damage on our way out again. It's like, there's a Swedish saying, if you step into an accordion, keep your foot there, because it will sound equally bad when you draw it out from the accordion. So it's, but it occurs to me that it might be interesting to also at some point talk about efficient decision making in policy, perhaps.
Yeah,
more of a craft episode. More of a craft episode.
Absolutely, I think that's right. Yeah, the efficient decision making. I mean, again, you and I both had the same experience of when joining companies when it's relatively small, and you actually had a lot of scope to make decisions at the edge because there weren't the people in the centre to care. There weren't people onto whose desk you could throw these decisions. And then over time, as the organisations build up, there are more and more people who care about those decisions, and you then spend more time, instead of making the decision, sort of preparing the briefing for somebody else who's going to make the decision. And that, it's quite a fundamental shift in it. And as you say, sometimes that means the decision is made too late. And actually, it would have been better, I think, sometimes take the risk of the person on the edge, at the edge, making the decision, whether right or wrong. At least it would have been speedy, and the time delay can be absolutely, itself a problematic issue, and so you haven't necessarily
got lethal for many of the issues because you're involved in this issue and you're tied into a press cycle that's 24 hours and you get a decision in 72 during which time you're massacred by the press. Right. So it's not great.
And then internal comms also come in because, again, you end up, and I'm sure you've experienced this, is the awkward thing where you've made a decision, you thought it was a good decision. The first time that your CEO or the company leadership has become aware of it is when they read an article in the New York Times or something about the decision you made. And suddenly the note comes down going, how did we make this decision? And you're like, and actually you may have done the internal comms, but no one cared about it until it appeared in the New York Times because the email was there, but no one read it because it was just noise.
Here's a session we'll never do, which is executive management. Because it's but it is interesting. And at some point, this sort of it might be interesting to dive into the Silicon Valley dynamic with, what's a founder-led company? What's the role of venture capital in making policy decisions? How has that changed in the last decade? And I think there are tons of things there that we can dig into as well. So we have a lot of sessions left. That's good news, I think. And we have a lot of sessions for you to listen to. If you want to listen over the Christmas or the happy holidays here, there's certainly no dearth of content. And you can, let's just sort of make a short advertisement here in the middle. Where can we find all of these wonderful episodes?
So you can jump off from my website, www.regulate.tech, or if you go to Podbean, you'll find them on Podbean at Regulate Tech. I think it's the name of the podcast.
.podbean.com. Yes,
.podbean.com. Right. Or if you go to Spotify and search for Regulate Tech, Spotify, which I love and has just given me my highlights of 2021, which I really enjoyed. If you're a Spotify user, I'm sure this is the time of year when 17,000 hours I found, and lots of Britpop. Anyway, that was my thing. But Spotify also importantly has our podcast on it. So again, if you look for Regulate.tech on Spotify, then you'll find us there as well.
It sounded like we had an almost rehearsed transition there into talking about 2021 and the highlights from a policy perspective. So well done. So we talked about the podcast, and I must say I've really been enjoying the opportunity to make it. So stay tuned for more in the new year. But let's sort of just transition gently into chronicle mode. 2021. It was the year of Britpop, you just said. From a policy perspective, let's sort of do what do you think was the book of the year? The book that sort of came out and really mattered.
Yeah, I think the biggest decision was around tax. So that was the big one, and it's not sort of sexy,
decision. Sorry, sorry. So let's go with the biggest decision. I asked about books. Sorry.
The books. Yes, but no.
We'll come back to the books.
You've actually meant book. I was using a figurative book as opposed to a literal book.
Well done.
Yes, yeah. So of the figurative books, the issues that came out, I thought tax was the really big one that sort of not been mentioned that much apart from in nerdy circles. But let's just remember, as we went into 2021, there was still this feeling that's been around for years that the tech companies get away with not paying tax, and this is an outrage. And we were in a position where various countries around the world were drawing up their own tax rules that would have meant they're just going to grab money from the tech companies in country. And this particularly was targeted at US-based tech companies and would have led to the US Treasury feeling it was losing out and taking retaliatory measures and we were heading into a tax war with the tech companies in the middle. End of 2021, we're not there yet, but we have an agreement in principle, and there's a lot of technical work going on to make it happen where tech company taxation will change, and there will be a new formula that divides up how much of their profit should be taxed in different jurisdictions. And I say it's not over the line, but I am pleasantly surprised at the amount of progress that's been made to trying to resolve one of the thorniest issues that's been around for years and years. I mean, it's not limited to tech. We should be really clear about that. And actually, our tax episode number 13, lucky for some, we'll go into that in detail. But it's not, by any means sort of completely signed, sealed, and delivered. But there does seem to be general will on behalf of the US government and other governments around the world to come up with an enduring framework that means when a tech company makes money, everybody feels like they're getting a reasonably fair slice of the pie from the economic activity that's been created. And that's quite dramatic from where we were to where we potentially are going to be.
What about other candidates? Would you? Someone could say that 2021 was the year of content moderation. The Easy Code of Practice, the UK online safety, the DSA. There is so much happening here on the content moderation. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel it's the year of proposals, but it's not the year of substance yet. So the real substance is going to happen next year, in the sense of the nitty-gritty of actually sort of sorting out what these frameworks should look like. So the UK online safety proposal has been through what they call pre-legislative scrutiny, where a group of members of parliament hear from witnesses and respond to the government's proposal. And they've just published their report that sort of as a response to that. And then the government has to go back and redraft what it thinks the final version of legislation should look like. And then that will probably come before the UK Parliament spring next year and maybe get finished by summer or autumn. So we're still quite a long way from settling things. There's all sorts of moving parts still in there that haven't been resolved. The EU's proposals have been sort of more steadily working through the EU system. But again, as you and I know from having dealt with EU level legislation, there's still some way to go until you've got all of the different parties lined up. So I absolutely agree. There's been a lot of progress in terms of proposals, UK and EU wide, and actually Australia continues to churn out its proposals. Interestingly, nothing happening in the US still. I mean, substantively on this. Again, lots of noise, but the US, as we know and we've talked about, really struggles to find a legislative formula for dealing with speech issues without contravening the First Amendment. So there's very limited scope for the US Congress actually to try and regulate speech issues. And again, there's a lot of noise, a lot of these sort of going nowhere type proposals that you'll get in the US, but they're kind of very obviously going nowhere. And I still think a very long way from there being any consensus around the specifics of what should happen, as opposed to the general idea that something must be done.
So that's interesting. It means that you put your finger on something that you think will be a big deal in 2022 in terms of substance. So content moderation, we had a general rehearsal in 2021, but in 2022, this actually comes into perhaps not force, but at least it sort of takes its final legislative form in some places. What about, another candidate for sort of issue of the year, I think is quite obviously competition, if we come back to the US, where there's been a lot of focus on competition. And perhaps, let me test this with you, perhaps one of the most undervalued pieces of news that has come up this year was just quite recently when the CMA decided to unwind an acquisition for the first time. I don't know of any other competition authority that has done that with tech companies yet. But as far as I understand, there's actually really an unwinding being proposed for the first time.
The Giphy acquisitions,
exactly right. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the CMA is really an interesting one to watch because you're right. There are different debates happening in different places. The US has quite a lot of thinking, I think, going on. It's only now we've got the new Biden administration. They've got their people in place. They're kind of thinking about what to do next. But the court
and I
cases,
think the people in place is actually the 2021 is let's recruit all of the right people and put them in all of the right places. That's been the sort of the US approach, I think. So sorry,
exactly.
go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, but as I said, but the court cases are still showing how far they've got to go, because the courts in the US operating under existing law are not necessarily, finding in the way that critics of the big tech companies would want. And there've been some cases where they've, actually dismissed them and said there aren't competition issues here. Well, there aren't under current law, but you're right. The Biden administration has people in place who I think want to change the law, will want to recommend changes to the law in order to try and catch the kind of behaviours they think should be subject to competition enforcement. The UK, interestingly, is sort of just charging ahead, and they, as you say, they've sort of made that proposal around unwinding an acquisition, and they've also, if you see the noise, I think it's just this week, they're talking about the dominance of the app stores, the Google and Apple app stores, as a kind of major issue they want to look at. So the UK CMA seems sort of hyperactive in this area and is really sort of pushing ahead. And I think they can do that, in large part because they're quite a significant market from a digital point of view. They're quite US-like in terms of the use of services and the distribution of services, the kind of iPhone, Android split, all this sort of stuff. It's quite a US-like market. But it can also move a little bit more nimbly, I think, than somewhere like the EU, where competition issues, if they're dealt with at the EU level, there's a lot of machinery that needs to kick into action and pull in the same direction. It's quite slow. So you're right, we're seeing lots of different things, but the UK, I mean, again, it'd be interesting to see how much people say, look, we care about the UK market enough to accept these judgments. So far, I think the UK market is significant enough from a business point of view. But I think you're going to see the UK sort of moving ahead quite aggressively and quickly. The US perhaps sort of following through, depending on whether they can get the legislative changes through. And that, again, will, we have to say, in large part depend on the midterm elections they're going to have towards the end of next year, how those are going. Although there does seem to be some bipartisan support for changes. But I think for different reasons. So whether the motivations will allow those groups to come together will be an interesting US debate. And then there are some things happening, I think, again, at member state level in the EU, and obviously judgments that are being made at the European level that will, again, I think, be quite significant in 2022. I think this year for the EU has been largely status quo. It's not been a radical departure. There's been reinforcement of some of the judgments they've previously made, but I'm not aware of policy going in a radically different direction in the EU from the one that had been established over the last 2 or 3 years.
No, I think that's fair, and I think that the DMA is still being discussed, and I think
right.
there's an argument that this is another candidate for 2022. But if I wanted to sort of defend competition as issue of the year, I think I would point to this unwinding, because it's a new thing that's happening in competition policy. And possibly the other thing I would point to is the Italian decision to fine Amazon $1.3 billion. One of the things that the European Union has managed to do historically is to sort of collect all competition concerns into Brussels. If that no longer is the case, the landscape will be radically different. If you have to deal with like a German, a French, an Italian, a Spanish competition authority, because they all now want to compete with the CMA, for example, and they see, why should we be waiting for so long? As you pointed out, the European machinery might not move that fast. And if you end up in that situation, then I think that the first shots across the bow, or the first indications at least, would belong to 2021, don't you think?
That's right, and as well as the EU-US angle, we've got to keep remembering that there are competition decisions being made in Russia, in India, in other markets around the world that are also quite significant. So something just to be aware of, that we need to keep our eye on what's happening across the piece. And you're right, I think there will be. We're in a phase where political nationalism is still very strong, and you can look at over the decades things shift from multilateralism. The trend is all towards multilateralism. Let's try and deal with things at a multilateral level, through to no, it's really important I assert my national control over X. And it certainly does feel that the last decade has been a national phase. And I also think the more that you're in economic hard times, so the post the 2008 crash, and now with all the COVID-related economic hard times, the drive to do things at national level is ever stronger. And so you potentially have this combination of tech companies appearing to be even more socially powerful post-COVID because we're so much more dependent on them, and governments where the citizens are looking to them to fix things, and they're very much in the mindset that I'm going to fix it. The Indian government's going to put Indians first, and that's quite right at this time. And the EU government's going to put themselves first, and not even at the EU level. No, the French government's going to put the French first, and the Italians government's going to put the Italians first. And that's quite different, I think, from perhaps more comfortable times, where people can say, oh, no, I'm happy to pool sovereignty and do something in the greater good, knowing we're all going to be okay. Well, no, that's not the spirit of 2021. And I think there's no reason to think that things are going to swing too far back in that direction next year either. So it's still going to be a landscape of national stuff. And whether that's content regulation or competition, I think it's going to be done at the national level. The tax one that I mentioned earlier, there's this interesting exception where we've had the big national drive, and that does seem to be swinging back towards multilateral. But that may be also a recognition of the losers in this game. So with tax law, even if you extract a bit more tax from these tech companies, your own companies may end up losing when the US takes reciprocal measures against them. So in that area, there's that dynamic playing out. Again, in competition, that's possible. I'm not sure whether we've seen significant evidence of that yet, but you can imagine that one of the possible responses, if individual national competition authorities end up taking lumps out of global companies, is whether that is going to be acceptable. That's going to be seen as a detriment and a harm to the headquarters country of that multinational company, and whether they're going to start, pushing back or fighting back. So again, that's something we I think we've seen it in the aerospace sector, where you get these Boeing Airbus battles going on through the competition courts, and it's very clearly seen as a sort of there are national interests at stake, and maybe some of that will come across into the tech sector if there are more national competition decisions that seem to have an impact on the revenue of a global company.
Yeah. And so issue of the year, tax, with two close runner-ups in content moderation and competition, but we think that those are actually going to take main stage in 2022.
Yeah.
So let's invert the question. Which tech policy issue got the least love, was the coldest? Nothing really happened there in 2021.
Yeah, I was going to say from our podcast, the one that was least listened to was nudity when we talked about that, if you remember.
It's not a tech policy issue, Richard. I'm sorry.
I know. But the big tech policy issues, actually, I think misinformation, disinformation, while it's still there, has come off the boil in an interesting way. And I think because, again, it's not to dismiss it, but it was so closely associated with certain electoral outcomes that we haven't seen one of those electoral outcomes in a little while. And being candid, Donald Trump did not get re-elected. And therefore, there are, I think, sort of two big fears around misinformation, disinformation. One is in the political side and the other is in the health side. And the health side is still there, and we worry a lot about political misinformation in the health space, particularly around COVID. But I think even there is a, when you see the anti-vaxxers and people like that sort of coming out, it's kind of pretty apparent that, they're talking about well-founded beliefs. Yes, they're citing misinformation, they're pushing misinformation out there, but it's their own sort of behavior makes it hard to say, look, they were just ordinary innocent citizens minding their own business until misinformation turned them into anti-vaxxers. No, it's like the other way around. They were there. There's something sort of fundamental about their belief system. So I think on the health anti-vax stuff, I feel there's less of a tendency to say, well, if only social media would remove this stuff, it would be fine. Because it wouldn't be. It's pretty obvious that it still wouldn't be fine, because these people are, for whatever reason, political reason or anything else, they're against vaccinations. They think Bill Gates is poisoning people, blah, 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 blah. And then on the political side, we haven't seen the upsets. And we haven't seen, the kind of results that make people say, again, this outcome, this electoral outcome, is only due to misinformation or disinformation, is not an honest reflection of the votes that have taken place. Yeah. At the beginning of the year, there were fears that misinformation, disinformation was feeding, and there still are fears, are feeding those who want to challenge the result in the US. But the result in the US was a legitimate result that everybody can see was legitimate, was sort of, and was not governed by misinformation, disinformation, in the sense of the way that people cast their votes. Most people accept as a genuine reflection of their own political views. So misinformation, disinformation feels different in 2021 than it did in, say, 2017, 2018, 2019, following those sort of shock results in 2016 that certainly made that connection between misinfo and politics.
I like that. I think one of the other issues we discussed, where you could argue that there's been a lull in activity, at least, is copyright. Yeah. Building out, new copyright proposals or new copyright bills is not something that we've seen a ton of, I think, in 2021.
Well, they stitched it all up a couple of years ago, Nicklas. They've got now they're just with the EU regulation. Yeah. I mean, you're right. There's not new regulation, but I think it is interesting that the copyright holders certainly, it felt like they got what they wanted, 2 or 3 years ago, and now we're in that negotiation and enforcement phase. And I think there have been some quite big payoffs made under the EU regulation. So it'd be interesting. I think we're in the phase after the legislation where those who won in the legislation are now exerting their newfound powers, whether that's the EU or Australia over some of the news snippet type stuff.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so definitely a different feel to the mis and disinfo discussion, more of a sort of commercial hashing it out in the copyright space. So what about... what about bubbling issues for 2022? What do you think there's going to be any new issues in 2022 that we haven't had in 2021? You've mentioned two that you think are going to sort of balloon into full-blown issues.
Yeah.
But
I think there's some really interesting discussions around liability to be had. And so that's both the liability of companies and the liability of issues. This is kind of a really open one that to date, we've assumed that the platforms are, we've wanted the platforms to be liable for a lot of what happens across the platforms. That's been the general political view, that they should be liable for things that happen that are done by people on their services. And now, like, a lot of the legislation is sort of heading in that direction to try and create that liability. But I don't think it's fully worked out or fully thought through. Like, this question of, an individual comes online, they access an internet service, they do something awful. How do we assign the liability between the individual and the platform? And particularly when it comes to things like criminal liability, it's quite a big step to say, well, you platform are criminally liable for the thing that the individual did on there, either along with the individual or perhaps instead of the individual. We're just going to hold you liable and we're not going to worry about them. All of these questions, I think, have been bubbling around, but they're not fully worked through. And I think that's going to be a major issue in 2022 that we're not, people are not really focused on enough. There tends to be certainly in the debate in the UK, a little bit of wishful thinking. Well, we'll just make the tech companies liable and they'll just clean their act up. And yet, if you make somebody criminally liable for something that is impossible, you can't just clean your act up. You then have to make a hard decision about whether or not to operate in a market, and or who's going to hold the liability, or other ways you can hedge against that liability and try and push it back to somebody else. Do you try and create a formula where you push it back to the individual? All of that sort of stuff, I think, is massive. And yet is sort of undervalued and under-discussed to date. So we've gone from almost nothing can be done. The platforms are not liable. They've got all these exemptions to, full liability. And that will itself have huge potential ramifications if we do go down that path.
I like that. Another possible candidate that you could have gone with, where it comes to sort of new tech legislation that will actually be quite broad, I think, would be around blockchain and crypto, right?
Oh yes,
Do
yeah.
you think we'll see a lot of movement in that space?
I mean, yeah. So I guess there are sort of two aspects to that, and this is one area I'm being hesitant because I have to confess, like I have a sort of aversion to blockchain, and I don't know why. It's just one of those sort of irrational aversions to, because it feels like it's sort of massively oversold, and and I am in that, this is largely an over elaborate, over engineered, and very expensive database kind of camp, which is appropriate for some circumstances, but not for the broad range of circumstances where it's being proposed as a technology. But I do think, yeah, the potential we get there, the chances of there being a crypto crash are huge. Everyone who sort of looks at the market would say that structurally, because this thing is based purely on consumer confidence. If something is based purely on consumer confidence and there's no institutions to back it up in a lot of cases, then if the consumer confidence rolls out of control, dissipates, then there is no sort of limit to the depths of the crash that could happen. And when that happens, citizens are going to look to their governments to protect them. And it may be that governments today are going to say, told you so. It's your problem, nothing to do with me. But there comes a tipping point at which it's too important and governments can't do that. As you saw when the banks were under threat of collapse and the mainstream financial institutions, however much, people said, well, moral hazard, they should be allowed to go under, like governments couldn't allow them to go under. And crypto's not there yet, but it's not far off getting to the point where it's bound into mainstream financial institutions. And it may not just be the individual investors, but it's, if crypto assets are being held by major institutions, and if the major institutions are not properly hedged their crypto assets, and the crypto assets are threatened, you have this sort of knock-on effect to institutions that governments would normally want to prop up. And so I don't know. Again, very complex. There are people far more expert than me in this, but it does feel to me like governments are going to have to at least show their hand. And if showing their hand is to say, like, it's totally your risk, we're not going to touch it. Institutions, keep away. Institutions that we will have to prop up, we're going to tell you not to. And this is the Chinese approach, is kind of veering in this direction to kind of say, we may not be banning it altogether, but the governments make it absolutely clear that, it's totally at your own risk.
So but it's close to ban in many places. But I think you're right. But I think you're right. I mean, the point you were making about the regulation always following some kind of upset in an industry is a really good one. And I think that if you have a sort of financial crash-sized upset, then you get international regulation. If you have Enron-sized catastrophes, then you get at least national regulation. So there is a point at which you could imagine that space perhaps suffering through that, and then seeing regulation come in. Another candidate for you? So I think data protection has been fairly quiet. It's sort of, we have the GDPR, we're working through it, we're learning how to work with it. But one of the things that has happened lately, and there's some evidence of this in Canada, is that data protection law is shifting slowly from data protection as its mental model to decision quality. Justified decisions. So you're moving from you have the right to your data to you have the right to reasonable decisions, reasonable and fair decisions. And I think there's something happening in the underpinnings of data protection law that is really interesting. It might not come to fruition in 2022, but it seems to me that there is a almost like a tectonic shift in the way that people now think about data protection. It's not just about the collection of the data. That's not where the harm is. The harm is when decisions are being made about you in ways that you do not feel are justified or that you do not feel are fair and reasonable. And I think if that continues, and if we sort of see more pressure that way, that will be quite a seismic shift.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right to bring that up because the law does work slowly in data protection, particularly as it's going through the European system. And there are two big aspects that are still being fought through and are not settled, that might end up getting settled next year, that would be monumental. One is the question of data transfers, which is still not fully settled, and whether, global internet companies can have global data structures or whether they need to somehow compartmentalize them according to jurisdiction. That's not a fully resolved question. So that would have massive impact, not just for internet companies, but for everybody who deals with data, which these days is every business. And then the second one, to your point on the decision-making process, is this question of, profiling. And then in particular for the internet sector in relation to ads. And I know in our episode 37, we covered online behavioral advertising. And I think I confessed to you, after re-listening to our episode, I kind of sat there going, God, how can this model survive? It's so intrusive. and people listening might go, what's this guy saying? But it does feel, it does feel sort of like the risk profile of decisions made on the basis of collected data is a very valid concern, a very legitimate concern that people will have. And I wonder, having listened to that, if you accept the kind of core principles of the GDPR and you accept, core principles that say profiling is something you need to be very careful about, very transparent about, particularly when it leads to decision making. There are, I think, some really legitimate questions about the extent to which sort of monitoring people's activity on the internet and then building profiles about what you think they're like is sustainable over the long term versus, other sort of consent-based models for people to register their interest in something very sort of proactively with potentially some kind of incentive. So that's the core difference. I mean, the advertisers we discussed in our 2 episodes on advertising, I think the advertiser is quite legitimate and proper that people who want to market something can and should only reach those people who are likely to want that product. So it's good for everybody. It's good for the customer. It's good for the business. Blah, blah, blah. But there are different ways to do that. And the way we're doing it at the moment is this sort of passive collection of data that then allows someone to predict whether somebody is likely to want the product versus the active expression of interest. And it's logical why we do that, because the active expression of interest, people would normally expect to be rewarded for it. You'd have to form some kind of relationship with them already and entice them to do that, as opposed to the passive model where you can just look at them and make that profile. So I just wonder if there's going to be a shift from the passive to the active mode, where we will still get targeted ads, but they'll be based on active expressions of our preferences. That could be huge. Well, that would be huge for everybody.
Yeah. Interesting. So we have a couple of, it looks like 2022 will not be boring. And certainly for you tech policy professionals out there, this sort of spells job security, I think. I haven't forgotten my first question yet. I still want to sort of go through a couple of rapid fire questions with you on book of the year, for example. Yeah. So which book do you think had most influence on the tech policy debate this year?
So that's hard, because I have spent most of the year reading books about the British Empire. This year, which is because I can recommend Empire Land and the History of the East India Company, and so I'm pretty obsessively reading those kind of books. I'm trying to think of have you got a good tech policy book you can throw in? Because
I sort of feel I don't know if it was actually published this year, but I think it was. I sort of feel no, it wasn't. It was published a few years ago. But I sort of feel that the book that has dominated the different feeds that I monitor is Shoshana Zuboff's Surveillance Capitalism.
Oh yeah,
I think that has been a big deal, and certainly in a way that I think is interesting as well. It responded to a need to talk about the way the information society has evolved. Now, I don't agree with. I think I don't agree with most things in that book, and we can talk about why later. But I think it has certainly played a monumental role in a lot of the policy discussions.
Yeah, it's cited so commonly by people that I agree. It's hugely influential. So it's a couple of years. I think it's now been a much cited book. But yeah, that's a big one. I guess the other one. I mean, there is the internal document library of Facebook, I guess, is the other.
A bestseller, I understand.
The book that has been published this year is the internal library of Facebook, which has been pored over by a lot of people and read. So maybe that's something we should touch on. Yeah, just mention that happened this year before we move on. But again, interestingly,
yes,
now that we're, whatever it is, a month or two on from those disclosures that was sort of headline at the time, I think on reflection, there wasn't that much that was new in there. It was kind of reinforcing views that people already had. And as I reflected, I don't think I saw anything in there that was surprising. Not just to me as somebody who'd been on the inside, but I think generally it's not surprising. But what he did was actually to Shoshana Zuboff's kind of criticism as well. It sort of reinforced the notion that the problem is with the capitalism. it's tech plus capitalism that's the problem. That there is this. It sort of fed this view that there is this urge to make money that is distorting behavior in surveillance capitalism language. It's sort of in terms of data collection. The data collection is being driven by the desire to make money. In the context of the Facebook disclosures and Instagram disclosures, the suggestion was that content moderation and algorithm design was being driven by money rather than just pure data collection. So I think all of them add up to this essentially a sort of criticism of capitalism as a driving force for technology. Maybe that's one for us to come back to. Should internet services...
Capitalism is a really good... I think you're right, because it also feeds into the wider inequality debate and the discussion about whether capitalism is failing or succeeding in making sure that our society is developed in the right way. And I think it's a really interesting one.
Pull it back. Yeah, capitalism is part. I mean, it's a really interesting phrase, but it's that there is a profit motive. I mean, it's just sort of more narrow it down that things are done for a profit motive, as opposed to anything else. That's what people are really railing against, aren't they? And that if people are seeking to make a profit out of internet services, they will always act against the public interest. Is the view of the critics? Yeah.
It was also the year of founders stepping down. You saw Dorsey step down from Twitter, and I think this was the year that Bezos stepped down from Amazon, was it not?
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Yeah. So do you
I know where you're going with this. I know where you're going with this.
Okay, I'll stop there. I'm just thinking.
I'll tell you one thing that did jump out at me. There's when I read an article that kind of said Mark Zuckerberg is now the second youngest CEO because the new CEO of Twitter is older. And I have to admit, I had totally lost track of how old Mark Zuckerberg is. When I went to work for him, he was 25. So I went to work for a 25-year-old CEO. And maybe because of that, it's like in my head, he's still in his 20s, but actually he's 37 and the new Twitter CEO is I think also 37, but a few months younger. I'm maybe wrong by half a year or so. But basically, they're both in that 37, 38 zone. And apparently the new Twitter CEO is the younger of the two, which was quite something.
Yeah. But it's a trend worthy of noting that many of the tech companies that are under debate no longer are founder-led in the classical sense, which is sort of kind of it's not a big deal generally, but I think it is. It's a few articles have been written about it and what it means and how it will perhaps change the way that these companies act in the future. So it's one to sort of just gently note in your yearbook. So I just have to ask, what was your most listened song on Spotify?
Oh, my most listened song on Spotify was If You Tolerate This by the Manic Street Preachers, which is they're a Welsh indie rock band. They kind of passed them by at the time when they were actually fashionable, and now they're not really fashionable. But If You Tolerate This is basically a song about the Spanish Civil War, saying if there was a poster that actually had a picture, sadly, of a child who'd been killed in a bombing raid, and it was, if you tolerate this, then your children will be next. And it was trying to recruit people to go and fight the fascists in the Spanish Civil War. But it's quite a powerful song, and I had that on endless loops as I was doing my walking this year, trying to keep myself healthy during various lockdowns.
Yes, well,
yeah. And yours?
So actually, I don't remember which one was the top one, but the top three was Chemtrails Over the Country Club. by Lana Del Rey. I really love that song. I thought it was fantastic in so many ways. And then I think
was this a kayaking soundtrack as you were out kayaking?
No, I actually listen to music when I write. Oh no, I know what the first one was. It's you're not going to like it. It was Loom by Bonobo and I think this Icelandic artist who I always mispronounce, Olaf or something.
Yeah.
So that might, because I always listen to things when I write, and I listen to them on repeat, and so I end up listening. And it was like Spotify had this phrase. It was like, you listen to this 4,672 times, but who's judging? It's like, you are judging, Spotify. I hear you. You're judging. Yes. And so I thought it was hilarious. Well, we're breaking for the holidays, and we are going to return in the new year with more sessions. We have a few ideas already from this session, but we would love to hear from you and love to hear what you'd like for us to look into, or who you'd like us to invite to the show, because we need to get around to actually having guests, which we've discussed a couple of times. And I think with that, we're going to wish everybody happy holidays and a great restorative break, because we need it. I got a Christmas card today where someone had crossed out "Merry Christmas" and it said, "Hope you're keeping it together." Was the only text on the card. And it's been a difficult year, but I must say that all things considered, I've really enjoyed these conversations with you, Richard, and so thank you very much for doing this podcast.
Likewise, have a great break, and the same to all our listeners if they're in parts of the world where this is the festive season.
Indeed. Take care.